charla estará a cargo del expositor Fred Baker. Se les recuerda a todos, un pequeño anuncio nada más, que la traducción, en caso de requerirla, se encuentra afuera, ya que la charla se desarrollará en idioma inglés. Únicamente deben presentar su identificación. A continuación, los dejo con Rosalía Morales. Ella es directora ejecutiva de NIC Costa Rica.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias por estar acá. El día de hoy estaremos conversando sobre la neutralidad de la red. Este tema es uno de los temas más trascendentales que traen a la mesa de discusión en nuestro país. Y siendo que nos enfrentamos cada vez más a eventos que afectan directamente a los actores del ecosistema de Internet. Para NIC Costa Rica es un honor contar hoy con la presencia del expositor del calibre de Fred Baker, quien con su trayectoria de más de 30 años definiendo el rumbo del Internet, nos ayudará a ampliar el panorama, llevándonos a desafiar el estado de la Internet y a preguntarnos qué pasaría si la red no fuera neutral. Fred Baker asistió al Instituto de Minería y Tecnología de Nuevo México desde 1970 a 1973. Desarrolló la tecnología de redes informáticas a partir de 1978 en Control Data Corporation, Vitalink Communications Corporation y Advanced Computer Communications. Se unió a Cisco Systems en 1994 y se convirtió miembro de Cisco, trabajando en relaciones universitarias y embajador de investigación en 1998. Desde el 89, Fred ha estado involucrado en el Grupo de Trabajo de Ingeniería de Internet, el IETF, el organismo que desarrolla estándares para Internet. Presidió varios grupos de trabajo, incluidos los que especifican las bases de información de gestión, MIB, utilizadas para gestionar puentes de red y enlaces de telecomunicaciones populares. Baker se desempeñó como presidente del IETF del 1996 hasta el 2001, sirvió en la Junta de Arquitectura de Internet desde 1996 hasta el 2002. Es coautor o editor de alrededor de 50 documentos de solicitudes de comentarios RFC sobre protocolos de Internet y contribuyó con muchos más. Los temas cubiertos incluyen gestión de red, Open Shortest Path First, enrutamiento del protocolo de información de enrutamiento, RIP versión 2, calidad del servicio, intercepción legal, servicios basados en precedencia en Internet y otros. Además, se desempeñó como miembro de la Junta de Internet Society del 2002 al 2008 y como presidente del 2002 al 2006. Fue miembro del Consejo Asesor Técnico de la Comisión Federal de Comunicaciones de Estados Unidos del 2005 al 2009 y ha trabajado como enlace con otras organizaciones de normalización como lo es la UIT, y en el 2009 se convirtió presidente de supervisión de la serie de RFC. A partir del 2005 presidió el grupo de trabajo de operaciones de IP versión 6 en el IETF y representa al IETF en el panel de interoperabilidad de redes inteligentes de Smart Grid del Instituto Nacional de Estándares y Tecnología y el Comité de Arquitectura. Y Baker también tiene varias patentes registradas a su nombre. Y esto es uno de sus logros dentro de muchísimos más, y es para nosotros un honor contar con Fred Baker el día de hoy, que va a compartir con nosotros su conocimiento, su experiencia que tiene de primera mano en la creación del Internet y un conocimiento que nos ayudará a nosotros como costarricenses en definir el camino de neutralidad de la red en Costa Rica. Y sin más, los dejo con Fred Baker. Muchas gracias.
Okay, now it's not moving the mouse. Okay, Mauricio, how do I turn that off? That, yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, thank you. Okay, so a comment up front, I don't speak Spanish. So we have a translator and I encourage you to use his services. If you have questions or comments in Spanish, he'll translate them for me. So, okay, is that better? Okay. So an opening remark, I don't speak Spanish. So we have a translator here, and I encourage you to use his services if you need them. And if you ask me questions or make comments in Spanish, he will translate for me. So I hope that this will be a reasonably interactive session. I'm going to be covering a number of concepts, and we can have dialogue about, you know, what's going on. The fundamental question here is net neutrality. What is it? How does it affect Costa Rica? And you know, what might be something that you're concerned about. So I'm going to talk about that. Now, to do so, I'm going to start out with a question of what the internet is. And now I'm sure you all use the internet and you kind of feel like, well, yeah, that's this thing that comes out of the Wi-Fi and I can connect to all kinds of things. I want to talk about where it came from, what it was that the designers, which I'm not one of the original designers, but I've been involved for a long time, what were they thinking about? And then how has commercialization changed the network, and what have been the legal issues that came up? So I'll go through in kind of those steps. Now, what's the internet? The concept starts with a fellow by the name of Licklider. Licklider was a professor at MIT in the 1950s and 1960s. And he talked with his students about this concept that he had, that he didn't have any implementation of at all, but he said, wouldn't it be nice if you could walk up to a computer and it had all of the information in the world? You could ask it any question and it knew the answer. Now, this computer that I'm showing you is the SAGE computer that was used for North American air defense. It had 60,000 vacuum tubes. This is ancient history, okay? But when he said I could walk up to a computer and ask it a question, this is the computer he was thinking of. You know, or this is the kind of computer he was thinking of. And of course, computers have come a long way. And now, do you think of yourself as living in science fiction? Today, we live in what not too long ago was science fiction. Now, this picture is from the 1994 movie Star Trek IV. And Scotty and McCoy, the chief engineer and the doctor from the Enterprise, find themselves looking for a whale and looking for a place that would house a whale. And so Scotty needs to use a computer. And he walks up to a computer of the day, which is a 128 kilobyte Macintosh. And he picks up the mouse and says, "Computer," expecting the computer to respond verbally. The computer didn't do that, okay? Now, we do that now. We carry computers. I'm carrying one with me. We carry computers that are far more capable than this thing that the SAGE computer was. This guy has more memory, more computing capability than most computers that I've worked with before 2000. And we look at these things and we say, hey Siri, or Alexa, or hey Google. Oh, and now it wants to know how it can help. She says, I'm not sure I understand. But, okay, we talk to computers. And now, in 1994, that was science fiction. This was intended to be funny. People would look at that and say, that's crazy. It doesn't work that way. It works that way now, okay? We find ourselves living in science fiction. Now, Licklider is saying, suppose you could walk up to a computer and ask it any question and it would be able to give you an answer. I think that he would understand the World Wide Web. He would look at the World Wide Web and say, I recognize that. That's what I was talking about. Now, his student, a fellow by the name of Len Kleinrock, wrote his doctoral thesis in 1962 on the design of packet networks and survivable networks. There were several people working in different places that were doing things related to that. And in 1969, the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the U.S. Department of Defense commissioned a network to allow the researchers to test the ideas. That was the ARPANET. The first exchange that happened across the ARPANET, according to Len Kleinrock, and you can find this, by the way, on YouTube, Len Kleinrock telling the story. You've got a bunch of students at UCLA and some more students at Science Research International. I'm sorry, Stanford Research International. It changed its name. And they had a computer, and there was a terminal at UCLA, and they wanted to log in. And so they had to write the word L-O-G, log. And so now you have to imagine a whole bunch of people standing around, and I'm about to write the letter L. Okay, we're looking for the letter L. Okay, I typed an L. Thanks, we saw the L. Now go to the next letter. Okay, now I'm about to type an L, an O. Waiting for the O. We see the O, that's great. Now let's go to the letter G. And they got the letter G to the computer, and it was, wait a second, the computer crashed. That was the first message to cross the ARPANET, a failed attempt to log into a computer. Also, in 1969, a researcher at the era by the name of Steve Crocker wrote a very short document in which he described a series of documents that the researchers could use to communicate with each other. You know, if you want to describe a technology, brainstorm an idea, whatever that might be, you could write one of these documents and it would be put in a repository and stored there. And it was called the Request for Comments Series, RFC. Why did he call it that? Well, so understand that Steve has just recently retired. He was for a while the chair of ICANN. He's held a variety of positions. And he's someone that I happen to know. And so he was talking about this, and he said, I called them that because I didn't want to draw anybody's attention to them. I could have called them the series of specifications for all communication in the future, and it would have been correct. But I didn't want to get people excited. I wanted to provide a way to allow people to talk to each other. So he called them RFCs, basically to fly under the radar, to not draw the attention of the telecoms or the regulators. Now, the vendors, people like me, called them requirements for compliance because we actually did need to comply to them. Okay, they were specifications. In 1972, Louis Pizon, in a network in France called Cyclone, came up with what at the time was a revolutionary idea. He said, what if I do in packets in the internet the same thing that we do with postal mail, which is that I take whatever it is that I want to send, I put it inside some kind of an envelope, and I give it a source address and a destination address so that the packet knows where it needs to go. And the network can now look at the packet and say, fine, I'll get it there. At the time, the way information got around was you would set up a circuit, and it was a semi-permanent thing that knew how to conduct the data that was in it. And so then you would put data into the circuit. So this was kind of a new idea, and we picked that up in IP. We said, okay, this is actually a good thing. It allows me to build a fairly simple network and allow people to interact with it in a simple way and make the right thing happen. Now, to give you an idea of what that looks like and how that works, I've got a picture from, this thing is really loud. I've got a picture from Google Maps of Costa Rica and a road that goes across it. And now one thing that I might do, of course, if I want to go from Jaco to Limon, I might simply take that blue road down the middle and say, whatever happens, I'm taking that road. That would be analogous to a circuit switch network, which is how MPLS and ATM and X25 and frame relay, a variety of technologies actually work. And how the traditional circuit switch telephone system worked. So this is what we call circuit switching. The interesting thing about that is that it very simply and easy gets a packet from here to there, as long as there's no problem. However, how many of you have driven in San Jose? How many of you have encountered traffic in San Jose? Okay, suppose you had a problem that you couldn't get around. In a circuit switch network, the packet has to go back to the source and say, what did you want me to do? Because there's no way to get through that. Now, in the datagram model, you name the endpoint. You say, go to Limon. I don't care how you get there, go to Limon. And, well, there's more than one road. You could go north on 126 and 4. You could go south on 219 and 230, and I guess that's 415. And you could go different ways to get around the problem. The datagram network has the capability of kind of self-healing in that way. Okay, so in the internet, by putting a destination address in the packet, lo and behold, it can get there. This was in 1972. This was a revolutionary idea. And it's, in fact, how the internet works today. Now, in 1973, a fellow by the name of Bob Kahn gave a talk in which he described this network that they were talking about building that they hadn't built yet. They kind of started some experiments, but they hadn't built the whole network. And he said, now, we'll have a core thing, which we call the ARPANET, and then a bunch of other things that can connect to it. And each of those stands on their own. To connect to the core and to other things across the network, works for me. Does that work? I guess it works. Probably much better. Okay. Do I need to go back and start at the beginning? Okay.
I would say yes.
Okay. So the ground rules of this thing that they were starting to call the internet. Each of the networks around the core would stand on their own. They would connect to it, and they would talk, and they would do whatever they do. And then the communications would be on a best effort basis. That was terribly, terribly controversial. At the time, the networks that people were trying to build were reliable networks, which is to say a network that would guarantee that a packet would get to the other side and it would be delivered once and in order. And in the internet, that's not true. The packet usually gets across. It's probably delivered in some semblance of order because it's transmitted in order. But that isn't guaranteed. You can duplicate things, you can do whatever. And that got people really concerned. You know, can this network even work? And then there would be gateways in between the edge networks and the core network that would act as routers across them. They were later called routers. And there would be no global operational control. Nobody in a government or anywhere could say, I'm tired of this, shut it down. And oh, that got people excited too. What do you mean I can't turn it off? People were very concerned about that. Okay, so now if I look at the network today, and I've obviously just gone fast forward about 40 years. Today, the core, which at that time was one network, is about 10,000 networks that offer transit services between the domains at the edge. NICCR offers, in some respects, a transit service. Some of the ISPs in Costa Rica offer transit services. And then there's another 50 or 60,000 networks that connect to that and communicate in various ways across it. And about half the world actually is connected today. And it continues to operate on the same principles that Bob Kahn espoused in 1973. And you know, today it works. We've had our exciting moments, but it in fact works. And the primary service of the network is connectivity. If we can provide connectivity, then people like you can concoct applications and put them up and make the right thing happen. You know, so that's kind of, in a nutshell, in a couple of slides, the story of the internet and its original development. Now, there was a big change in the internet in the 1990s. And that was, people discovered you could make money using the internet, and it became commercial. And, well, there were a lot of things that had to change as a result. Now, the original designers, as I said, were thinking in terms of a best effort network, a semi-reliable network. And the term reliable was very important to them because of what I just said. It was a technical term. X25 was reliable. A best effort network is not reliable. It's not reliable because it doesn't guarantee that the packets will get across. What happens instead is that the systems at the endpoints of a conversation will use TCP or some other protocol and work out among themselves what the sequence of packets is and so on and so forth. But what it did depend on was a behavior in the underlying network, a behavior that we call a common carrier. Now, what is a common carrier? That's a legal term. It was developed in the 1800s, and it described wagon trains and horses and things that could carry a package. And if you could walk up to a business and hand it a barrel, a package, a box, and say, please deliver that over there, the guy would get it over there and then deliver it. That's a common carrier. Okay? Common carrier will carry anything for anyone. You know, there's probably laws that apply to that, but basically it carries anything for everyone from here to there without looking on the inside. Have you guys seen a movie called Transporter? Are you familiar with that movie? Okay, so a couple of you are. I find the movie interesting because it has a wonderful description of a common carrier. The story is that there's this guy who has a car, and he will drive to you, open the trunk, look the other way. You can put anything in the trunk, and then close the trunk. He drives to where you tell him to. He opens the trunk and walks away. And the first movie, he's transporting a woman. Other movies, he's got other things, and usually kind of shady, okay? But it's actually a wonderful description of a common carrier, okay? Doesn't look at the package, doesn't know, doesn't care. So the interesting thing with the internet is that it becomes a service that anyone can innovate over. Now let me give you, as a parallel, the way your mobile phone works. Now your mobile phone has a communication link with the service, the telephone company. That service might actually carry several phone calls. It might also carry data. And embedded in it, it has this concept called the short message service, the SMS, which you and I call texting, okay? And that's built into the carrier that goes between the telephone and the telephone company. Now, if I want to change it in some important way, I have to go talk to the telephone company. And I have to convince them that I'm going to send them something different. And they need to do whatever it was that I said to do. So deploying a new service in the telephone system is actually really hard. It can take a decade, it can take years. Because they have to go change equipment. Maybe they have to install new equipment. They have to do all sorts of things so that the basic service, whatever it is, will work. In the internet, as long as everything's running on the same common protocol, which is IP, the carrier doesn't care what you're sending. And so it's actually easy to deploy a new service. To give you an example of that, in 1992, researchers, people that I worked with, were looking at the traffic that was crossing the NSF net, which was a major part of the internet in that day. And at the beginning of the summer of 1992, they observed that a typical TCP session was maybe a couple hundred packets in each direction, a whole bunch of traffic. And at the end of the summer, the total amount of traffic had quadrupled. The typical packet size had become smaller, and the length of a session was now only maybe 10 packets each way. And my goodness, what happened? And we went and we looked at the traffic. Is something broken? What's going on? And we discovered that 75% of the traffic was using port 80, which is to say that it was World Wide Web traffic. Now, that was revolutionary, and it happened without any of the internet service providers knowing or caring. It's, oh, those guys at CERN, they've got a new application. That was kind of the total comment that people made, okay? So the internet, as originally conceived, depended on the idea that the underlying carriage was that of a common carrier, that we could do things and innovate, and the world would go forward. Now there is one change happening right now where we're actually changing the underlying carriage, and that's the deployment of IPv6. So that's fundamental. So that is kind of a big deal. But for the most part, the applications that run on the internet have that characteristic. We call it permissionless innovation. So now then we observed a whole lot of things. And now I'm coming at this from a vendor perspective. I worked for Cisco at the time. And so we put out a thing that would do IP routing, would carry packets around. And we had our customers come back and say, but I want to direct certain traffic stream down this direction and another traffic stream down that direction. How do we do that? And we wound up inventing MPLS and figuring out how to do traffic engineering, which is actually very important in the internet because commercial customers wanted better guarantees. They wanted to know that they could send a certain amount of traffic from here to there and the right thing would happen. They came back and did something that personally I'm not fond of, but once again, our customers were asking for, could we put in the data stream that's going out a way to insert an advertisement and maybe even change the advertisement. You know, as somebody over here inserts an advertisement, here we take it out and put in a different one, which is something that happens especially in mobile networks. They'll realize that you're walking past a certain store and all of a sudden the advertisements you see on your phone are, don't you want to buy whatever it is that that store sells? Commercial networks wanted control of their data and a variety of reasons. Some of them were anti-competitive. You know, that's my competitor. I don't really want to carry his traffic. Or I want to make sure that I get paid or something like that. And then governments, and not just one government, and you can't really divide them among the good guys and the bad guys governments, okay, had a variety of issues that they wanted. The US government periodically tells us that they would like to somehow stop all copyrighted data or stop certain copyrighted data. There are political issues that come up. In China, it tends to be very hard to find an article from outside China that contains the word China because they will block it, okay? There's attacks of a variety, a wide variety of attacks. There's malware, there's criminal behavior, and oh, by the way, the police want to look at it, try to catch the bad guys, okay? So with commercialization, there were a variety of things that the original researchers didn't really think about that all of a sudden became important. And this idea of a common carrier coming from law wound up affecting things legally. In the United States, oh, well, okay, so an example of the limitations that companies wanted to have is like, okay, I've got a wagon train, you can put your box on my train, and I'll carry it from here to there, but I only want to provide service to customers that I want to provide that service for. Or I'm the government, and I want to limit some of it in some way. I want to intercept some users. You know, they want to look at the drug trade, for example. They want to find people that are selling drugs or transporting drugs and figure out how to make that not happen. In the mobile network, it's very common to find them wanting to regulate services of certain applications. In the wireline network, peer-to-peer file sharing for a while was something that ISPs would routinely block because it consumed a lot of their bandwidth, okay? So they said, I don't like that application. And right now, there's kind of a tussle between the ISPs and the some of their largest customers, people like Google and Facebook and so on. Google and Facebook would like to see ISP rates regulated so that they don't have to pay as much as they might otherwise. The ISPs are saying, no, don't regulate me, I want to charge a lot. You know, so there's a lot of the companies found the limitations of being a common carrier problematic. And in the US, that came to a head in about 2003 when 2 US carriers decided that they didn't want to carry traffic for Google and Yahoo because they used a lot of traffic or produced a lot of traffic and didn't pay for it. And so, and so that was the part of the really public net neutrality debate. Behind the scenes, the FBI was pushing very hard at the time for the ability to intercept criminal traffic malware. And the FCC finally said, no, we can't give you that capability because the ISPs are regulated in a way that says they're not a common carrier. They don't have to carry certain traffic, and they're not required to give you the ability to intercept traffic on their networks. And so companies like South Central Bell and Verizon said, wait a second, if we're not common carriers, I don't have to carry their traffic. And so they decided to block Google and Yahoo, and all of a sudden, this topic made the papers. Now, so what's net neutrality and why should I care? In 2003, when all that was going on, a Harvard professor by the name of Dr. Tim Wu published a paper in which he titled Net Neutrality, and in which he described a principle of the relationship between a company and its subscriber. And what he said was that a customer had a right to reasonably use his connection in ways that are privately beneficial and not publicly detrimental. Customer has the right to use his network connection in a way that's privately beneficial and not publicly detrimental. So for peer-to-peer file sharing, which was a big question at the time, the customer had a right to operate an application as long as it didn't hurt the network. And the thing that Google was doing, which now you probably don't think about this too much, but when you go to Google and you say, what color is the sky? And it comes back and says, the sky is blue, you idiot. Yeah, that's the color of the sky. It knows that factoid, and it knows whatever links that it finds because it does a lot of research. It sends messages out, and it finds out what's out there and what people are saying, and is then able to definitively answer questions. And of course, it's not just Google, it's Yahoo, and it's DuckDuckGo, and it's all of those. Okay, so what Tim Wu was saying was that it's reasonable for Google to do that research, which is what Verizon and South Central Bell were complaining about, as if they're privately beneficial without being publicly detrimental. So an example of how that principle changed things, Comcast at the time was pushing back very hard on peer-to-peer file sharing. And what they would do is if they detected that you were doing that, they would simply cut you off. We're not carrying that traffic. And they came up with something that they documented in an RFC, which said, no, on the local carrier's network, the thing that your house connects to, we will run traffic round robin. And so the effect is that most of the people on that network get basically as much as they can use, and it's not really a problem. But if they get one or two customers that are really generous, they put a volume cap on it, but just they said, you need to leave enough space for the other people to get in. Has to work not only for you, but for everybody else, okay? And so by doing that, then they made it be a private application that's privately beneficial without being publicly detrimental. So this non-discrimination principle that Dr. Wu talked about winds up applying to a lot of traffic, a lot of applications, a lot of stuff in the network. And the principle that he was asking for in the paper was how to discriminate between what is lawful, what's not lawful, and enable networks and people to be able to treat it accordingly. And if you want to read his article, there's the link. You're going to make these slides available, right? Yeah. Okay. Now, in 2005, the FCC was looking at this and arguing and trying to figure out how they wanted to move forward. And they decided that they wanted to put forward 4 basic principles. A user has the right to generate and to access lawful content, has freedom to run lawful applications, has the freedom to connect devices that don't harm the network. Now, that doesn't excuse a spammer or somebody that's distributing malware, because they do harm the network, okay? But he has the freedom to attach devices that are not harmful, and he's allowed to know what his contract means, which sounds like a really basic concept, but that wasn't necessarily the case. And that got an awful lot of discussion going in the United States. In 2010, a revision of that came out as the Open Internet Order. The hammer came down and said, you know, this is what you have to do. So they rephrased that as 3 bright line principles. They talk about transparency in the network, no blocking. You know, I'm sorry you don't like what that guy's doing. If it's legal, you can't block him. And there's no unreasonable discrimination. You know, if you don't like the person, tough. It's a common carrier, and you know, you're going to provide those services anyway. Now, in other words, and I'm putting this in my words, ISPs were not allowed to behave in an anti-competitive fashion. They weren't allowed to behave in a way that hurt other companies. And the subscriber should be able to know what their contract meant, how it should work for them. In 2015, now between 2010 and 2015, you can imagine the ISPs got all upset. And they went to the court, and what they questioned was not the principles. What they questioned was the FCC's authority to impose them. And so they argued about that for quite a while. And basically, the courts came back to the FCC and said, now the way you're regulating the ISPs is that they are not technically common carriers, but they have funny attributes that really aren't written in law, but they're required to accept an intercept order from the FBI. They're required in many ways to behave like a common carrier. It'd just be an awful lot easier. We could eliminate a lot of this legal wrangling if you would just say they're common carriers, okay? So the FCC did so. It applied the same regulation that has been applying to the telephone system in the United States for quite some time, except that they backed off on some 700 different, 700, that's a lot, 700 specific things like pole access and other things that weren't particularly relevant to the internet industry. But it said, okay, so we're going to apply Title II of the Telecom Act of 1934, but we're going to ignore important parts that apply to the telephone system and don't necessarily apply to ISPs, okay? So, fine, 2015, they said that's the rule. And you can imagine there were people that liked it and people that didn't. But, you know, there was a lot of discussion there. And now, when that ruling was made, the FCC consisted of 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. One of the Republicans was a fellow by the name of Ajit Pai. In 2017, when Mr. Trump was elected, he changed the FCC. It was now 2 Democrats and 3 Republicans. And Ajit Pai became the chairman of the FCC. Now, in 2015, when it came out, the two Republicans wrote a minority opinion. They said, we disagree. We don't think it should work this way. In 2017, they had power, and they said, we're just going to throw the whole regulation away. Just gone. And you can imagine there's been excitement in the United States about that. California recently passed a law which they're holding back for the moment, but passed a law about net neutrality. I think it's about 20 states have passed laws implementing net neutrality in one way or another. And Ajit Pai basically said, no, we're going to blow up that ruling. It doesn't exist anymore. We don't have that anymore. And what happened in the United States? Well, legally, it was very exciting. So now, you're going to ask me, fine, that's the United States. They're crazy in the United States, and we understand that. What has that got to do with little tiny Costa Rica? And the thing is, Costa Rica has what it is. You have 121 authorized internet service providers. You have a variety of services here that do various things. You are primarily IPv4, but there are ISPs that are experimenting with the next generation network, and thinking in those directions. Those service providers have exactly the same commercial pressures as service providers in the United States. And I understand that your government, your new government, is in the process of figuring out how it should regulate the internet in Costa Rica. Is that a fair statement? Yeah. And this is one thing that I would suggest you want to think about. Okay, do we let the service providers do bad things to each other or to other companies? And not that I think poorly of the ISPs. Please understand me. I'm sure they're great people and they're trying to do the right thing. But they have the same commercial pressures that led companies in the United States to do these things. And so one thing you want to think about is the internet as it started out in 1969, 1970, depended on the concept that the network in between was a common carrier, that it didn't open the package, it didn't filter things in strange ways, so on and so forth. And I think you want to have the same considerations that we're looking at in the United States. You want in your regulation, you want to have that concept. Now, am I asking you to regulate the internet? No, heaven forbid, not. But that's going to happen. There will be rules. And so think about those rules in this context. That's a place you want to make sure that the fundamental assumptions of the internet continue to work. Okay? So, fundamental premise of the internet as developed as we've been working in it, I use we, I've been doing this for 30 years now. Fundamental concept is permissionless innovation. The idea that I can come up with an idea, I can come up with a World Wide Web, a Facebook, a Twitter, and start deploying it and use it with my friends, use it with my customers, and maybe it becomes a big deal, And I can treat the underlying network as a common carrier, something that will convey the data from here to there without particularly blocking things or whatever, okay? And the problem is that various companies, not just the ISPs, but other companies, will kind of say, well, but it's my network and I want to do something. You have to figure out that tussle and make the right thing happen in it. Okay. So the net neutrality concept is that a company should not behave in an anti-competitive fashion, and as implemented in the US 2015 order, the 2010 order, a customer has the right to know what his service is doing. He's paying money for a service. It's in his interest to know what that service does. Okay, so that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. And with that, I've actually reached the end of my prepared comments. Do you guys have questions? Do you have things you want to discuss? What are you doing here, Gringo? There you are. Okay. In Costa Rica. So we've gone back and forth. In 2015, the FCC put out a bunch of positions, and those got revised a couple of times, but gee, it should work this way. Those were the things that I so these concepts, this is actually from a paper in 2003. 2004, by the then FCC chair. And he said, my opinion, not a ruling, but my opinion, that should be true. And then for a period of about 5 years, there was people trotting off to Washington and saying, I disagree, or I do agree, or there's some other aspect that has to be considered. And there was a huge debate in front of the FCC about those concepts. And that resulted in the 2010 order, which talked about transparency and non-blocking and unreasonable discrimination. So that actually was put in place. But then Comcast and Verizon went to the court, and the court said, well, but you can't apply this rule, or you can't apply that rule. And like I say, the fundamental argument was about whether the FCC had the authority to impose that. And basically because it was supposed to be about signals. It was about radio. It was about electricity on a wire. And now we're talking about services, which are very different space. So they argued that the FCC didn't have the authority to do that, at least not using the part of the Telecom Act that they used as a basis for doing so. And so then in 2015, the FCC was basically pushed into a position of saying, okay, we're going to use Title II. There's a whole lot of it that we're not going to use, but we're going to use Title II. And we're going to say that the system has to operate as a common carrier. Must be. And then in 2017, that was rescinded. Okay, so right now, there's no rules. Okay, yes, there have been rules imposed at various times. But right now, there's no rules.
Okay, the question about the last decision made by the FCC with Ajit Pai and all the things you already explained was because a lot of people here in Costa Rica or around the world has services with AWS or Azure, etc. That traffic eventually gets to the United States and has to travel within the networks. So whatever the decision the carriers, the ISPs made or gonna make are going to affect outside United States anyways, because our traffic
surprise.
has to travel.
I've been told that if we in the United States have a cold, the rest of the world has pneumonia.
So exactly, it actually has a lot to do with Costa Rica and the other countries, because even though here our ISPs maybe are working on things like this, but it's not already implemented, currently we are going to be affected for the decisions over the traffic that travels through US soil. So it is actually affecting or going to affect performances and everything.
Well, it certainly can affect the performance of those services. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about, but let me take a minute. I should have drawn a picture of this, and I'll draw one and include it in the slides when you, okay? But you can think of the internet as kind of two separate kinds of services. At layer 3, at the network layer, it carries packets from here to there. At layer 7, in the application layer, it provides services. So Facebook, Google, AWS, those are all applications. And so the net neutrality order doesn't apply to them directly, because any traffic that's within an AWS network or within a Google network is theirs. It's within their network. Where the net neutrality thing becomes an issue is when it leaves that network and it goes to someone else, and that someone else might be in Costa Rica. Okay, so you've got what I would call information services under the law. That's another discussion, but you've got the applications running and doing whatever applications do, and they use the services of the network. Net neutrality applies to the network. Okay? Now, can that affect Costa Rican traffic? Yes, it can if the Costa Rican traffic is crossing the United States or going into the United States. If the service that you're going to is somewhere else, then it doesn't affect it. Now, I don't know of a particular case like I'm about to describe here, but if I go across the United States northern border with Canada, turns out getting from one city to another very often is difficult from a communication perspective, because there might not be a convenient fiber run in order to actually carry that. So traffic would go from Vancouver in Canada to Chicago in the United States, and from there to Toronto or Montreal in Canada. Conceptually, that traffic is all within Canada, but as far as how the network layer works, it went through the United States. And so there can be that kind of an impact. And I'm talking with my own country, but it crosses the United States. And that's actually something that Canadian companies get fairly excited about, because there are tax rules about crossing the border. And well, their traffic crosses the border, and they don't want to hear about it. So yeah, there are issues like that. But as much as anything, I'm looking at the traffic that stays within Costa Rica. If I have a company in, I forget, what were the names of your cities? If I have a company in San Jose and one in Limon, their traffic should be treated as common carrier traffic within Costa Rica, even though it doesn't go to the United States.
If a common carrier is charging more or less depending on the data rate that it can provide, is it being anti-competitive?
I'm sorry.
If I'm a provider and I offer you a service for 10 megabits per second at a certain price, and then another one at 25 megabits per second at another price, and then another for a whole gig at another price, Does that have anything to do with net neutrality? Because I am allowing some customers that can pay more money to be more competitive than others that cannot afford such a good quality connection, or not really?
No, not really. So at my house, I buy a 50 megabit internet connection that happens to be the lowest rate that I can possibly get from my company. They have other rates that they sell other people, and they charge more money. That is not anti-competitive because they're not forcing somebody to not use the network, okay? They're telling me how much they'll give me and asking for an exchange of value. But they're not forcing somebody to be unable to do things. Now, if, for example, I could talk to this bank but not that bank, that would be anti-competitive because they're forcing this bank to not work, okay, or you know, grocery stores or whatever. If there's a distinction among different endpoints that you can talk to this but you can't talk to that. Or another version of this is what's called a walled garden, and for a while was very common in Europe, that within my network I have access to, you know, whatever it is that I have access to, and it works very well. The next network over has access to other things, and that works very well, but I'll now put a 1 bit per second link in between the two. So yes, we're connected, but it doesn't actually work. And that would cross a net neutrality boundary because you're dealing with your network layer competitor. Okay, you're saying, not there. I want to drive all those customers to become my customers.
So you have to provide some kind of minimum bandwidth to make sure that you're not playing with low rates as a pressure mode that is not blocking. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and so that 1 bit per second link would be considered blocking because frankly it doesn't work, okay? Now if it was a 10 megabit link and kind of everything else in the network was gigabit, then maybe that's considered blocking and maybe it isn't, depending on the effect that it has on the traffic. Right. So there becomes a place where you go to court and you talk about it.
All right, last question. So I guess ISPs are talking about 5G and 1 millisecond latency, these kind of things. Is there any kind of relationship between the political part of net neutrality and them being actually interested in this kind of research because they want to provide better services? Or at some point, they could argue something like, no, now I cannot charge for a better internet, so this is as most as I'm giving you, and I'm not interested in giving you a better service. Does that make any sense, or are they always interested in providing better quality internet?
They generally do want to improve their service quality because that attracts customers. That's how they get money, okay? Now, there is a legal issue in Europe. It turns out that what you and I call internet, coming from a service provider, is a specific service. And they might offer several other services that are what they call specialized services. And so with this specialized service, I might have a VPN that goes within my company, but among the various sites of my company, for example. Or might do different things. And what the European rules have said very clearly is you can do that, that's okay. And that's frankly where a lot of ISPs make their money, with specialized services. But you can't provide a specialized service that basically replaces the internet, okay? So, so the internet still, the broadband, very general network still has to be available. Someone else?
So I have a two-part question. It mainly has to do on how net neutrality regulation could affect, at least in a country like Costa Rica, the internal workings of, let's say, startups and companies, as well as Costa Rica's ability to compete internationally. So maybe if I give you two examples and ask you how net neutrality regulation would affect in these examples. So let's say the first example would be two companies in Costa Rica. They work on data centers, and they start with the same amount of money. They start with the same amount of resources. How could net neutrality tip the balance in favor of one or the other?
Well, once again, I'm referring to U.S. law, and I'm pulling this example out of a course that I took in, this must be about 1978. My company wanted me to know what competitive and anti-competitive behavior was so that I couldn't get the company in trouble with anti-competitive behavior. And one of the examples that they gave me was, you have two guys, they each own a hardware store, and they're in the same city. And they go golfing together, which is perfectly legal. They're friends. They go play golf. And out on the 9th hole, way back in the middle of nowhere, one of them says, as he's putting, Monday, I'm going to start selling hammers for this amount of money. And it's a very low amount. The other guy says nothing, doesn't respond. But the following Monday, he starts selling hammers for that amount of money. They have done what's called price fixing. They have set a price, they have agreed on a price, and the objective then is obviously to sell hammers and have people not go to other hardware stores to buy hammers. Okay, so that's an anti-competitive behavior. Your two startups here in Costa Rica, if they're operating in a way where they have some private collusion and they work in a way that is now anti-competitive with other companies, or if their service provider operates in a way that favors them and doesn't and hurts other providers, whatever that service might be, then that would be anti-competitive. If they're simply two companies and they're setting their own prices and they're doing whatever their business plan calls for, they started out with the same amount of money, they started out with similar resources, they developed whatever it was that they were doing, and they went forward with that. They're now doing competition. That's what competition is. And that's perfectly legal.
Okay, and now talking about internationally, I can give you a very specific example. I help out with an open source project that has to do with blockchain. And in the core of that has to do with a lot of giving access to people to resources, to data center resources, bandwidth, CPU power, and all of these things. And the way this project works is that rather than having everybody in the blockchain network giving the confirmation that something in the blockchain has happened, there are 7 data centers in the world that get voted regularly to be the ones that represent everybody who voted for that data center. So normally certain regions are competing for having that vote. And
so examples of those data centers might be Azure and AWS, and the vote would often be done with money.
Exactly, the vote. Well, actually, the vote is given by people just as an open vote, and you're telling this data center, I give you my trust because you have like a lot of CPU power. You have great transparency. So maybe then, how could net neutrality regulation affect Costa Rica's ability to compete, to be like to have one of those be voted against maybe another data center in Argentina or another data center maybe in the US or et cetera? Like internationally, how could it affect us?
Okay, well, understand, number one, I'm not a lawyer.
Right,
okay?
right.
And I wonder if this question is getting into territory that a lawyer should be answering.
No, no, just in general.
But the thing that would worry me in your description is that it's a closed market, that somebody can't come along and build an 8th data center and move forward with that. That would be, that would seem to me to be anti-competitive because it's denying access to new entrants, okay? Now, assuming these 7 data centers are from different companies and this is a truly open thing as you described, I doubt that that crosses the line per se, but the denial of a new entrant sounds very dubious to me.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Hi, Fred. So you followed the net neutrality discussion in the U.S. very closely, and you've been part of the people, the fathers of the internet who have come to Congress and defended this concept and explained it to the FCC and to Congress members as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what advice would you give us here in Costa Rica whenever we have to go forth with this debate and actually talk to political leaders about this, and maybe even the local regulatory agency called Subtel here in Costa Rica? What advice can you give us from these years of experience you have in trying to get this message across?
So let me fill in a little on what you said my experience was. As I say, in the United States, we have 20 states that have come up with net neutrality laws. And in the House of Representatives at this point, we have 4 different legislators that are writing something, different proposed bills, that might be as simple as you have to enact net neutrality, or more complex things. There are also 2 citizen groups that are working together to provide proposals for legislative action. And I'm involved with one that's being led by the Internet Society. Okay, so that's kind of what we've got going on. There's a bunch of people that are thinking about this. They have the same endpoint in mind. They have different ways that they're approaching it. But I think that there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. One of the things that we're looking at very hard, turns out that we have a different agency, not the FCC, whose fundamental purpose is to manage competitive and anti-competitive behavior. And that's the Federal Trade Commission. And so Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission's defining act talks about anti-competitive behavior, and please don't do it, and here's what happens, so on and so forth. The big problem with the FTC's act is that it responds to individual requests. Somebody sees a problem and they raise a flag, and then they go investigate it. There's no general rule other than Section 5 itself, which says, don't do stupid things, guys. Where the FCC, in net neutrality or in the lack of net neutrality, is preparing a playing field. And these are the rules of the playing field. And so there was a legislative proposal that didn't become law called DACA. And for those of you that know US law, I'm sure you've all heard the term DACA, and it means something else. It means children that were brought, undocumented children brought to the United States, and making sure that they don't get all screwed up in the process of this big thing that we're dealing with. Not that law, different law, okay? But the Digital Age Communications Act, DACA, was a proposal to try to rebuild net neutrality, and it was in 2005, So this is at the time that the open internet order was being discussed, and that kind of thing. And the proposal that I'm involved with, one of the principal architects of that proposal is one of the guys who wrote DACA. Okay, so guess what? We're looking very hard at DACA. And what I might suggest is, from a legal perspective, that you look at that and you ask yourself about the thoughts that are set forth in it. And as Costa Rica, what do you want to do in Costa Rica? What should Costa Rica look like from a networking perspective? And I think you might find some useful concepts in DACA. And I think you need to have a national discussion. And now I don't mean throwing darts at each other the way we do in the US, but what kind of service do you want? What's your objective? What is going to be the best thing for Costa Rica? And I have my ideas. I've talked about a number of them. I'm not Costa Rican. You are. So what do you want? Tell me about your country. Well, tell you about your country and decide what you want networking to look like in your country. I think you need to have a national discussion. And in a large part of that, I would look very hard at anti-competitive practices and anti-competitive behaviors. So in the car coming over here, you were telling me about the incumbent big ISP and kind of the seven dwarfs, all the little guys, and how those ISPs have become important in large part because they've been able to provide services that are comparable now to the incumbent ISP. And, well, okay, competition is usually a good thing in terms of price and in terms of developing new services. That those ISPs might go develop a new service, and it might be exactly what Costa Rica needs. And, gee, they need the ability to go do that. So I think having a multiplicity of players, not just one guy who rolls over in bed and the rest of them suffocate, but a variety of players competing in the market and trying to serve the needs of Costa Rica. I think that there's a lot of value in having a large number of players, and not just a large number of, I operate a post office and I deliver to the house next door, but regional and national scale ISPs. And I would include in that data center capabilities and kind of whatever else is needed. So does that, okay. We seem to be running low on questions. Mauricio.
From the ISP perspective, what would be your recommendation for them? Looking at the internet ecosystem, how is it evolving? And what would be your recommendation, for example, to an ISP who is actually analyzing these kind of practices that are being done in other countries regarding to, for example, zero rating or so on, practices that actually break net neutrality? What would be the risk, and what would you recommend also for us as users that we can go ahead and do or demand in this respect?
I think the principal problem with not having the common carrier behavior is that it breaks things. It favors some and doesn't favor others, and that can have very negative consequences. In Europe, I don't know, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, they passed a new regulation from the European Commission going down to the, what is it, 46 states of the European Union, and telling them that they need to operate in certain ways and not operate in certain ways. I mentioned earlier the thing about specialized services, that you can't have a specialized service that replaces the internet, that you still have to have general internet access. That doesn't have to be a dominant service, but it needs to be there and it needs to be usable. And so now the places where that has broken down, I would look at Europe before that regulation came out. I would look at, you know, the United States in 2002, maybe 2010, and what was happening to the industry while all this was going on. I brought up the example of Comcast and file sharing, and the fact that Comcast tried to simply block file sharing applications. The big problem with that was identifying a file sharing application. It was encrypted, and they did all sorts of things to not be identified, and which Skype still does today. And so the fact that they were trying to block file sharing services, they often wound up damaging other services as well. And that ultimately hurt people, okay? So turning around and saying, well, no, you can't block an application. What you can do is provide a way in which the user of that application can't put you in a bad position with the rest of your customers. I think that has significant value, and that helps basically everybody. Okay, let me give you an example of the, did that really happen? Yes, that really happened. I had a phone call with my cousin who lived at the time in Carlsbad, California, and he was complaining to me that the internet just didn't work. Life is terrible, internet doesn't work. And so I happened to know somebody at the service provider that he used, and I went to her and I asked her, you know, what's going on? And she said, well, give me the address. I gave her the address, and she said, okay, that particular area, that particular street, we have one customer that generates an awful lot of what looks to us like video traffic. We're not looking at the traffic, but just looking at the statistics and the volume. It looks an awful lot like video traffic. And we suspect that it's a woman, and she probably has customers, and you can imagine, right? And the net effect, she shuts down everybody in her neighborhood. We are basically trying to figure out how to convince her that another ISP would be a better place to be. You can imagine that discussion. So yes, that can happen. And so where the ISP finds itself doing something like, in the case of this particular customer, making sure that their traffic didn't block all the other traffic around, then the ISP can now deliver a service to all of its customers that all of its customers find acceptable. And if the net effect on this particular customer is that they find another ISP better, you know, good riddance, off they go. And so, so now I'm reaching back, and exactly what was your question? I'll bet I'm not answering it. Remind me what the question was.
So you already mentioned what could happen from the ISP perspective.
What has happened to the ISPs? Okay. Well, in general, with the ISPs offering what is actually a better service, I think they've benefited. Okay. Now, I can't point to one and say they're making money and they didn't used to. But I can certainly say that that the ISPs as a whole and the edge service providers as a whole are in better shape than they were before. Veronica?
The next question is going to be in Spanish, so allow me a moment to get the translator to you.
Okay. Okay.
Ready? Yes, ok. Mi pregunta es la siguiente: ¿cómo hacer para fomentar una participación activa desde edades tempranas en cada individuo o fomentar ese involucramiento dentro de los grupos que velan por la neutralidad de la red?
How would I encourage organizations to be involved in net neutrality? I don't know a lot about politics in Costa Rica, but I'll bet you talk with each other from time to time. And that, I think, is the fundamental thing that I would suggest. In America, we have something called the League of Women Voters, which actually started out with women. It's not now female. But it was a place where people could come together and discuss the political issues of the day. And they worked very hard to provide non-discriminatory, rational information about ballot issues and about candidates. I don't know whether you have something like that in Costa Rica, but I can tell you that in the United States, the League of Women Voters has been a real benefit. Yeah. Once again, I don't know what you do, but if you have forums like this where people get together to talk about issues, then go there and say what you think, or get educated, or learn about it, share ideas. So.
I have a question, but it's more for the people of NIC Costa Rica. So I will make it in Spanish. You don't have a problem.
So. Thank you. Okay.
Básicamente la pregunta para los compañeros de NIC Costa Rica es si en este momento hay alguna preocupación, alguna discusión, algo que tengamos que preocuparnos en cuanto a la neutralidad de la red en Costa Rica.
So the question is whether you have something to worry about?
In Costa Rica.
I would say no. I'm not here telling you, please worry. But I am telling you, please be aware. And if worrying becomes the right thing to do, maybe you should do that then. But follow the politics and be involved in them, and be aware of the impacts of different proposals.
Okay, thank you.
Y para agregarle a la pregunta de parte de NIC Costa Rica, va muy alineado con el pensamiento de Fred, de tener conciencia, de estar involucrados. El hecho de que Estados Unidos haya tomado una decisión donde no hay ningún tipo de posición alguna con neutralidad, básicamente siguiendo muy alineados con los intereses de los proveedores de Internet en el debate nacional de Estados Unidos, hace que el debate mundial de neutralidad, el lugar que creó el concepto de neutralidad, se pierda este líder mundial. Entonces deja a todos los países a tomar ahora decisiones. En realidad siempre han podido tomar esa decisión como un país independiente, pero ahora sin un líder que creó y que fue siempre el ejemplo a seguir en mejores prácticas del Internet. Hemos perdido ese líder actualmente en el debate mundial del Internet. Así que nos deja la responsabilidad a nosotros de saber de qué se trata, saber qué queremos para el país y cómo lo queremos hacer. Entonces creo que va más alineado con el tema de que tal vez el día de hoy no es el tema más candente en la agenda política nacional, pero no tenemos que dejar a que llegue el punto en que somos nosotros los que estamos desesperados por el servicio que se nos está dando, que simplemente nunca se respetaron los valores de neutralidad. No lleguemos a ese punto, no seamos reactivos, seamos proactivos. Entonces va más por ese alineamiento.
So, well said. Okay, so more questions, more comments? No, I'm done.
Maybe something else that you can comment on is on the applications side. It's there are a lot of discussions going on different applications. Not naming them, but basically that some groups ask, for example, the government to go ahead and block the applications because different interests. What happens if a government, in particular in our government, if they took the decision to start shutting down, for example, specific websites or specific applications, what would be the implications in net neutrality in that, if that happens? And why is it important for us as users to be aware of that and also continue promoting the net neutrality on the application side?
Well, toward that, I would say that net neutrality is only part of the conversation. But then also, you're going to have websites here and in Mexico and other places that you go to. And if the governments are running around shutting them down, then I would ask, why are they shutting them down? Is it because they're delivering malware? Because they're doing something illegal? Or is it a political, I'm going to silence the opposition? Okay, and if they're dealing with unlawful content or unlawful behavior, that's one question. And I would think that that's partly why you have a government, is to deal with that. Okay, but at the point where they're shutting down political opposition or materially changing the national dialogue, well then you need to stand up and do something about that. In the United States, we had a war over it. That was fundamentally one of the issues of the American Revolution.
Okay, regarding to applications and services, how can a small business, content business, can compete against Google, for example, to offer a better service if they pay for that service, Google, as an example?
So how can a relatively small company or service compete with the big boys?
Yeah.
That's actually a discussion we're starting to have in the United States. There's a set of people that are asking about, talking about breaking up Google, breaking up Facebook into separate companies along the lines of their various services. We've done that once before. We had a common telephone carrier that was throughout the United States. It was American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. And in, I think it was 1984, 1985, a judge by the name of Judge Green ordered that it be broken up into regional operating companies, basically because it was a regulated monopoly. Everybody knew it was a monopoly. But it was doing things that were actively hurting consumers and hurting communications. And so it was broken up into South Central Bell and Southern Bell and so on and so forth, a number of different companies. And the funny thing is that in the 40 years since then, those companies have kind of come back together. And there's still issues related to that. But yeah, there's questions right now about, so I don't just have Google. I have Google Fiber, which is a network. I have Google Search Engine. I have Google Maps, I have Google Translate, I have service after service, which has come from Google, and they're often very good services. And what there's some discussion of is breaking them up so that they're not one company. That might happen, it might not, I don't know. But that is, people are concerned about that in the United States.
¿Nadie más?
What can we do in order to fight to not good practices like zero rating?
Say again, please.
What can we do in order to fight to not good practices like zero rating?
What do you do to prevent zero rating? Oh. Okay. So I tend to think there's a mixed thing there. Do you own a Kindle? Veronica, do you own a Kindle? A Kindle? It's a little computer that you read books on? No? Okay. Do people here? Okay. So a Kindle is zero rated. What happens is you decide you want to buy a book, and you're buying it from Amazon. Amazon then tells the ISP, I will pay for the bandwidth necessary to deliver the book. Okay? So it still gets paid for. It's just paid by somebody else. That is an example of zero rating. Okay? Now, I think that's fine as far as what Amazon is doing with the Kindle, because it doesn't hurt anybody, but it allows them to deliver a service. The only real question is who pays for it. And okay, Amazon has said that they will pay for it. Where people get excited about zero rating in the net neutrality discussion is a company using that to control its subscribers. Say, well, you could go to Google, you could go to Yahoo, you could go to, any of a variety of search engines or DNS resolvers or whatever. But if you use mine, it'll cost you nothing. I will pay for the bandwidth. And with the effect now of convincing all of its customers to access its own services. And that is anti-competitive. I mean, they're targeting now other services, where you could go and get that information or that whatever from somebody else. So I hear a lot about zero rating. I think it's actually mostly mistargeted discussion. I don't see a problem with zero rating per se. I have a problem with anti-competitive behavior. And so if it's not anti-competitive, then to me, think of what Amazon does with the Kindle. It's a way to deliver its product. I don't see a problem with that. Okay, but if it's now anti-competitive, that's a whole other discussion. So now you had a question you wanted to raise.
Yes. Before you mentioned that some ISPs wants to block Google because of the Google's traffic. But it got me thinking if it refers to Google's operations or my research on Google, mostly because I think, okay, I ask if the sky is blue, right? And let's say Google has it in its database, so it just go to its own database in its own network and give me the answer. But if Google has to research other places, that's the traffic you're referring that Google is consuming, or the bandwidth Google is consuming from the ISPs, or is my research to Google? That is because I want to know if I'm paying by 5 megabit connection. If I use that 5 megabit, what's the problem? I mean, what is the ISP complaining about? But if it is because of Google's own operations that is consuming ISP's bandwidth, that it confuses me, because if Google is paying for that bandwidth, what's the deal? What is the problem? It makes sense?
I think so. So let me try to repeat back what I heard you say. When users buy their own bandwidth and they go access Google, that's the user paying for their own use of the bandwidth.
Yes.
But Google's research thing is they're starting from a Google site and they don't ever get to the user. They go to things that they might then direct the user to later, and they find out what information is there.
Yes.
And use that to build their search engine. And that turns out, as a total amount of traffic, that can easily be an order of magnitude more than the total user traffic going to Google. Okay? So when the user buys their own bandwidth and goes and accesses various services on the network, one of which is Google, Google can't come back and doesn't have a way to come back and say, please credit that person for their access to me, okay, which would be a form of zero rating. That's not a capability that they have. So in that case, the user is providing their own bandwidth to access Google. The issue was Google then coming out and doing its research and not paying for the bandwidth that the research required.
Yes. Thank you.
Fred, over here. So going back to the zero rating subject, you mentioned that zero rating per se is not exactly anti-competitive. Can you maybe illustrate or provide an example of anti-competitive zero rating?
Okay.
Or explain
could
what
I,
to look at.
So the thing with the Kindle, you're essentially buying a service from Amazon. And part of that service is that Amazon buys the bandwidth to upload and download the book, or whatever it is that you're buying on the Kindle. That's not anti-competitive because they're not making some other service be in a bad position. But now, and the example I'm going to give you, and I'm very carefully picking this because it's one that is not current, okay? I'm not saying, look at them, they're bad, okay? But there was once a company called At Home. At Home did an awful lot of caching of content. And they did that caching basically to reduce their requirement for accessing other networks around them and save them money. And so they worked very hard to prevent people from doing certain things and actually charged them a surcharge when they, instead of going to At Home's caches, went to a service that was on another network. For At Home, it's obviously a good thing. It reduced their costs, okay? For their customers, it meant that they got cached content which might or might not be current. There could be problems with the cached content. And there were also problems. Quite often we'll have a provider who offers something on the web, and they want to know how many times it's accessed. So now if it's cached, they can't see the accesses to the cache. And by the way, the cache might be 70 or 80% of the hits. So now what they wind up coming back to is they'll negotiate with the cache provider to tell them, you know, your content was accessed this number of times by these people, and give them that capability. So now what At Home was doing, I would describe 30 years later as anti-competitive, okay? Because it was preventing people from accessing content that was somewhere else, and that hurt the somewhere else.
Thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Then I'm going to go for another one.
Okay.
So, sorry. So, FCC current position, or actually the current regulation, is there's, in essence, no regulation, right? Has customers and users somehow started feeling the consequences or getting the consequences of that? Are you aware of any, let's say, questionable ISP practice? And I'm thinking that maybe for us Costa Ricans who are still are trying to get into the discussion of net neutrality, is there something that you can refer to that we can look out for? Maybe some practices that might be a warning to us that net neutrality is somehow at stake?
I have read a number of accusations along those lines in the media. As far as I know, the courts have not ruled on them. And so, you know, I would far rather, if I was going to point you, you know, see this guy, he's bad. You know, you wouldn't like it if I did that to you. You know, I would far rather I had a court ruling that said somebody authoritative agreed that that was a bad idea. But I certainly have seen discussions of cases where it might be going on.
But nothing yet going to a judge or, you know, some sort of administrative process, right?
Not yet. That I know of. That I know of.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Me gustaría saber si se ha hecho algún análisis acerca de cuál es la información, la plataforma o las aplicaciones que se pueden ver o se han visto afectadas por esta falta de regulación.
Well, I'm going to give you essentially the same answer that I'm giving Mauricio. The rescinding of the regulation happened just a year ago. And there are certainly practices that are wandering around. And I have seen reports in the media where, you know, look at that, they're behaving in a not neutral way. In the last year, I haven't seen court cases, you know, come to start and finish that a court has turned around and said, you know, so this was actively bad. So I'm not going to point to cases like that. That I think that would be inappropriate. But the question is certainly being raised.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? No, todo muy claro. I think they're done with the questions. So, muchísimas gracias. Yo creo que if you don't have anything else to add, do you have anything else?
I never talk.
Never. Muchísimas gracias a todos por haber venido el día de hoy y acompañarnos en esta charla. Agradecerle a Fred, thank you so very much. Y los que tienen dispositivos de traducción, les recordamos entregarlos en la entrada para que sean devueltas sus identificaciones. De parte de NIC Costa Rica, reiterarles el agradecimiento por habernos acompañado el día de hoy y les pedimos que estén atentos a las redes sociales de NIC sobre eventos futuros por venir. Muchísimas gracias y buenos días a todos.